the works of John Nelson Darby sounded rather pretentious, as if his writing could be compared to that of the worthies of dissent. Some of his early readers shared his concern. One of their number wrote to his publisher, complaining that the works of John Nelson Darby sounded rather too assuming. Never shy of working to control his image, Darby admitted that the title troubled me as soon as I saw it, and suggested to his publisher, George Morrish, who'd been working on the project with his editor, William Kelly, and his landlord and factotum, G.V. Wigram, that something along the lines of collected papers and tracts might be a more modest alternative. Darby and Wigram were old friends. Wigram might have been one of the few capable of joking with Darby by misspelling his name in Greek. Well, Darby's concerns were not unfounded. After all, he was only 66 when the collected writings began to appear, and the project that Wigram believed would amount to 15 volumes grew to more than 34 without ever being complete. The project to gather Darby's writing recognised his status in the religious worlds of the 19th century. Whether he liked it or not, by the mid-1860s, as he was making his first journeys across the Atlantic, Darby was being recognised as the Goliath of dissent, and in particular as the most important leader of a new religious movement known as the Plymouth Brethren. He was a prolific and often polemical author. After 20 years of pamphleteering, he took a leading role in the bitterly fought division of the Brethren into open and exclusive networks, respectively, those Brethren who favoured local autonomy and those who favoured some form of connected decision-making in ecclesiastical discipline. That division took place in the late 1840s. The division provided his work with new energy, and while he never abandoned the occasional writing for which he'd become well known, he moved increasingly towards more substantial and programmatic projects. His achievements were extraordinary. During his lifetime, he wrote over 850 separately published items, from pamphlets to weighty tomes, with subjects ranging from biblical exposition, theology, and devotional poetry, to details of Greek grammar, political commentary, and reflections on the work of J.S. Mill. His first major publication was the synopsis of the books of the Bible, published in French in a single volume in 1854, and then in a set of 5 volumes in English between 1857 and 67. During the same period, he led projects to translate the New Testament into German, 1855, French, 1859, and English, 1867, and continued to work on successive editions of these translations with their Old Testament counterparts until his death in 1882. He developed an interest in apologetics and wrote to confute the claims of his old friend Francis Newman in The Irrationalism of Infidelity, 1853, while also writing a book-length reply to the philosopher's brother, the celebrated John Henry Newman, in 1866. Darby was the author of articles and reviews for which Brethren periodicals and periodicals outside the movement made competing bids. Many of these articles were turned into separately published texts. His notebooks, some of the contents of which were published after his death, contained work on an even wider range of subjects, including reviews of current scientific publications and scholarship on the history of Indo-European language, Hinduism, the Book of Enoch, and Kant. From as early as 1827, he took notes in his 4-volume interleaved Greek New Testament, a bespoke text that's never been systematically described. From as early as the mid-1840s, he made comments in his blank-paged Bible, a commercially available edition that printed the authorised version on the left-hand side and lined pages on right-hand side pages of the text. Only parts of these annotations have ever appeared in print. He also annotated his Hebrew Bible, which has subsequently disappeared. None of his exegetical notebooks appear to have survived, and if the reference in his blank-paged Bible to notebook R is any clue, this collection of manuscripts might have been substantial. Despite these significant losses, his published and extant manuscript writing amounts to around 19 million words. Now, for all that Darby should be recognised as one of the 19th century's most prolific and varied religious writers, he did not delight in his literary work. He feared that writing was a distraction from his evangelistic and pastoral labours. "I am not ambitious as an author," he explained to a close friend. "I sometimes fear of getting too much even on scripture instead of working for souls." But Darby knew that his writing mattered, initially to set out the claims of a small group of individuals, and latterly to connect these individuals across enormous distances. From the 1830s, his writing linked brethren in Britain and Ireland with others he'd encountered through his missionary work in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Holland. These networks expanded throughout the empire and into North America. By the late 1860s, they extended from Ontario to California, from Texas to the Caribbean, and as far east as India. By the mid-1870s, they stretched into the Antipodes. By the time of his death in 1882, Darby's writing had turned a coterie into a network, and a network into a global community. Darby recognised the danger of depending on the printed word. With other of the movement's thought leaders, he worried that brethren were producing too much writing and too many periodicals, some of which too obviously reflected narrowly commercial interests. In private, he was candid. I rather fear brethren overwriting themselves, he explained to Wigram, for very few minds modulate and coordinate truth, and it is apt thereby to lose its energy. Quoting the Roman poet Horace to the effect that all of us, learned and unlearned, alike take to writing, he admitted to being growingly dissatisfied with brethren tracts, in which ideas he feared were too often taken by themselves and pushed to an extreme. What he described as brethren truth was being, he said, mutilated to please the public or exaggerated so as to be false. And yet, whatever Darby's hesitations about publicity, the influence of his ideas continued to spread. By the mid-1870s, 11 Brethren journals had been established, some with a circulation of over 40,000 readers. By the time of his death in 1882, Darby's writings had become canonical among Plymouth Brethren and regarded as exemplary by the growing number of preachers and theologians from mainstream denominations who in the early 20th century turned his insights into the theological system that became known as dispensationalism. Darby's most extensive legacy would be found outside the Brethren movement, in the North American evangelical cultures of which he was so critical, within which his ideas were cherry-picked for purposes of which he could never have approved. This process shows how religious influence could be created, not through ecclesiastical office or institutions, but by means of uncoordinated entrepreneurial activity, largely in print. For, towards the end of Darby's life, leaders from several denominations, appalled by the cultural turn that followed upon the American Civil War, adopted and adapted several of his key ideas. In the 1910s, the end times narrative they fashioned shaped in powerful ways the revolutionary conservatism that rocked American Protestant churches. While so-called dispensational ideas were not central to the essays that were published as the fundamentals between 1910 and 1915, a redacted version of Darby's ideas was disseminated in the Schofield Reference Bible published by Oxford University Press 1909, which is circulated in uncounted tens of millions to define the movement known as Protestant fundamentalism. I just put this slide up really briefly to let you contrast on the screen Darby's annotations, which are very, very much focused on text criticism and issues of proper translation, compared to Schofield notes on the right, which are much more polemical, discursive, and theological in tone. Now, as Darby's arguments were abbreviated and dispersed more widely than ever before, they were largely forgotten in Britain and Ireland. But they came to shape American born-again religion and the global community of 600 million evangelicals that it has influenced, so that, as Donald Akinson has recently argued, Darby could now be recognised as the fourth most important theologian in Protestant history. However, this claim about Darby's status is a retrospective evaluation. In the 19th century, Darby would not have presented his teaching as any kind of ism, as if it constituted a perspective that could be balanced off against another. But religious nature abhors a descriptive vacuum, and as his work was redacted and commodified, it was given this distinctive appellation. By 1913, the term dispensationalism had emerged as a disparaging descriptor in prophetic debates among Protestant fundamentalists. The first usage recorded by the OED appeared in 1928 in a hit piece that distinguished the dispensationalism of the Schofield Bible from the much more conventional Protestant theology represented by John Nelson Darby. But the term became increasingly used to refer to Darby's work too. And so the rise of what became known as dispensationalism provides key evidence for the transformation of American Christianity and describes the reduction rather than the exposition of Darby's ideas. So who was Darby? Well, Darby reconstructed his early life with reluctance and with some freedom. Autobiography, he said, was an unpleasant and unsatisfactory, a dangerous thing, he observed, as he set about creating a sometimes chronologically uncertain version of his early life. Yet the main details of his biography are clear. He was born in London on the 18th of November 1800, just 6 weeks before the Acts of Union created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and merged to establish churches to form the United Church of England and Ireland. Darby's family had important connections in England, Ireland, the United States and the Caribbean, by means of which his father and uncles had become extremely wealthy. His father, who'd made a fortune in trade, had links to the Royal Navy, which warranted his youngest son, John Darby, being given Nelson as a middle name. This reference to the famous admiral spoke to the kinds of relationships that Darby, in maturity, could take for granted. Throughout his life, his network of family members, friends and acquaintances included members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. As the youngest son of a prosperous family, Darby was provided with an excellent education at Westminster School and Trinity College Dublin, from which he graduated in 1819 with a gold medal in classics. Following the path of two elder brothers who'd become barristers, Darby prepared for a career in law. He registered at Lincoln's Inn, London in 1819 and was admitted barrister to the King's Inns, Dublin, when he signed the Oath of Allegiance to George IV in 1822. He was preparing for a respectable career in the declining years of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. But this was a very searching time for the introspective lawyer. Darby was increasingly interested in religion. In 1819, he appears to have been reading the divinity of the non-jurors, those Anglicans who'd abandoned the established church in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution to set up what was essentially a Jacobite denomination of their own. This devout reading appears to have made an impact. Darby dated the beginnings of his spiritual life to sometime in 1820 or 21, and his hesitancy about dates is characteristic. He wasn't the first among his siblings to take religion seriously. His brother Christopher was already en route to becoming one of Ireland's leading high churchmen. In the later 1820s, another brother, William, engaged in warm correspondence with the reformist vicar general of the Diocese of Constance and might briefly have converted to Roman Catholicism. Darby himself felt the appeal of Catholic religion during this period. It might have been in this period that both brothers inscribed their names into a copy of the deliberations of the Council of Trent. Well, whatever his hesitations and whatever the appeal of other communions, Darby's new religious sensibility would be definitively shaped by high church cultures in the Church of Ireland. Now, as these religious interests developed, Darby decided to become a clergyman. While we don't know how he prepared for this calling, we do know that he purchased a clerical gown in December 1824, that he was ordained as deacon in August 1825, and as priest by Archbishop Magee in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin, in February 1826. As a young clergyman, Darby appears to have benefited from the support of influential figures. With the support of Magee, who pulled strings to make it happen, he was appointed to Callery, County Wicklow, at the heart of the church's evangelical network, where the so-called Second Reformation, a determined effort to promote evangelical conversions among Irish Catholics, was proceeding apace. There he worked for around 2 years and 3 months. He seems to have taken these pastoral responsibilities extremely seriously. His service among the rural poor earned him a reputation for saintliness. And he may have been an effective clergyman, for there is evidence that some Catholics within his parish did conform to the Church of Ireland during this period. But Darby was not yet an evangelical. He was still what he called an exact churchman, with views of the sacraments, ecclesiastical history and church-state relations that paralleled the attitudes of the more famous movement of Anglican reform that would come together slightly later in Oxford. For all of his ecclesiological certainties, he was becoming very uneasy. This was, he later remembered, an anxious time when he was awfully afraid, as he put it, for the prospects of his own salvation. He came to understand the emptiness of his efforts at self-righteousness before he fully understood his own position as a sinner, as he later put it. For all that he was involved in meetings of the Bible Society, Darby was still committed to high church theology, not least in his views of the efficacy of baptism. But it was at the end of this period that he experienced what he called the deliverance that brought him into a more obviously evangelical faith. In autumn 1827, he suffered a riding accident and left Calgary to recuperate in his sister's homes in Dublin and Dilgany. During those months of recovery, he developed the readings of scripture that would determine the shape of his future life, encouraging him to establish the theological binaries upon which his thinking would be based: distinctions between Israel and the church and the world, law and grace, this age and the age to come. These binaries represented the beginning of an intellectual revolution. His movement away from exact churchmanship can be traced to his writings of the later 1820s. Now, if we can date Darby's evangelical conversion with some certainty, we can't be sure when he left the Church of Ireland. It's not clear, as he later claimed, that he seceded in 1827. It might have taken him several years to finalise his break with the establishment, or even to realise that a formal withdrawal was something he might need to consider. Several times in his early writing, he wondered what to do. At times, he appeared to write in search of answers as much as to provide them. In one of his early publications, he anticipated the objections of those who would say, "If you see these things, what are you doing yourself?" And his response was ambivalent. He said he could only sorrow and mourn over his strange and infinite shortcomings and earnestly seek for direction. Now, this hesitation reflected his instinctive conservatism, but his writing in this period also reflected his growing certainties. For several years, he seems to have combined his ministry in the established church with an effort to develop something else. Later brethren remembered him as a clergyman who would climb out of his pulpit to walk down the street in his black gown to join non-denominational celebrations of communion that were taking place elsewhere. Darby was remembered preaching in the open air with a colleague reading the prayer book afterwards. For brethren only slowly began to develop their most distinctive positions. If they were resurrecting ancient truth, one of the Restorians put it, gravestones still hung about those that came out of the grave of ecclesiastical defection. Now, Darby's new churchmanship was certainly anti-formal. In the late 1820s, he became more involved in the drawing room meetings that attracted believers from across denominations for conversational Bible study and prayer. For several years, Dublin evangelicals had been gathering for fellowship, both in the office of the Bible Society and in private homes. In early 1828, he had made sufficient recovery from his riding accident to begin to take part in some of these meetings for fellowship. They made an impression upon his unsettled mind. He continued to think about Calgary's rural poor, and during his convalescence appears to have written addresses to these Roman Catholic brethren, as he put it, urging them to become Protestant. But despite receiving in 1829 a commendatory note from his parishioners, he does not appear to have returned to his County Wicklow charge. His interest in evangelising Catholics was growing more expansive. By February 1827, he was preaching in County Clare in conjunction with the Church of Ireland's home mission. These efforts resulted in conversions, including that of an individual in Carhew, who was, Darby remembered, the first person to whom I made myself understood in Irish. But these were challenging times, and it was during this period that the secretive and politically radical agrarian movement known as Captain Rock warned him against seducing the people by your Bible business and advised him to leave the district. Now, as Darby continued this evangelistic work in the west of Ireland, his friends were thinking about the nature of the church. The Dublin drawing room meetings were becoming both more public and much less formal. By May 1830s, these brethren had begun to meet in a rented room in Ongier Street, where Christians from lower social ranks began to be welcomed into the fellowship. Lady Powerscourt, who began to host prophecy conferences in her County Wicklow estate in 1831, joined this rather unassuming congregation in 1832. Darby seems to have identified with the congregation around the same period, describing in a letter of May 1832 its unity and sweetness of spirit. Now, this affiliation with a congregation that broke bread without clerical oversight might represent his giant leap out of the established church. If so, his secession could be dated with relative precision. In January 1832, Darby was surprised when Wigram and other brethren in Plymouth invited him to break bread in the absence of clerical oversight. But 3 or 4 months later, in a rented room in Dublin, he might have been doing so himself with much less reluctance. By the mid-1830s, Darby had come to formulate some of his key ideas. Working mainly in the west of Ireland and the southwest of England, and meeting fellow travellers at prophecy conferences and theological events like that convened in the Powerscourt estate, he began to advance new views on the church and the end times. His thinking about these subjects developed simultaneously, so that his ecclesiology and eschatology became mutually supporting. By 1833, he had developed the idea of a rapture in which true believers would be removed from earth as part of their experience of Christ's second coming. By 1834, he had concluded, as the tract in this slide puts it, that the notion of a clergyman, which arrogated to certain individuals the rights that belonged to all the people of God, was this dispensation's sin against the Holy Spirit. But it took time for his followers to recognise the significance of his break with the established church. In 1838, for example, one enthusiast for his preaching published transcriptions of his sermons that were still attributed to the Reverend J.N. Darby. In the 1830s, therefore, Darby was not developing his ideas in a vacuum. As he was coming to the forefront of what became the Brethren movement, his reading of Scripture and his understanding of contemporary cultural, political and ecclesiastical contexts developed in conversation with fellow travellers in Dublin and Wicklow in Ireland and in Plymouth and Oxford in England. Historians might have missed the significance of these conversations by reading the sometimes redacted versions of his texts that appeared in neglected writings after 1866, apart from the discursive context in which these publications first appeared a generation previously. But for all that Darby debated with and likely learned from his colleagues, he was very quickly recognised as the first among equals. The earliest issues of the Christian Witness, the Brethren journal that was edited in the Plymouth Assembly in the 1830s, presented the work of each of its authors anonymously, with the exception of work attributed to J.N.D. It's not clear how by 1834 Darby had gained this distinctive status, except through the force of personality that was being recognised by brethren as evidence of his distinctive spiritual gift. His status was also being recognised elsewhere. In 1836, a Baptist missionary in Limerick complained that several of his congregations had gone over to what he called the Darbyites. In the same year, Joseph D'Arcy Sir, an Anglican minister in County Galway, referred to Darbyites as one of the challenges facing the established church. Josiah Conder, an English independent, referred to Darbyites in 1838. Daniel O'Connell made fun of Darbyites in 1839. Darby's pop cultural apotheosis might have been complete if he inspired the description of a character in William Carleton's novel, Valentine McClutchy, the Irish Agent, published in 1845. Inside and outside the Brethren, Darby was becoming well known. His personal circumstances were changing too. We're left only with glimpses of his life in this period. In March 1835, for example, he was in Dublin visiting a young relative, being engaged from morning till night, preaching, expounding, visiting, and so on, including at weekly meetings for Bible study that were being convened by the pale, elegant, dignified, and retiring Lady Powerscourt. By then, the Dublin and Plymouth meetings were being imitated elsewhere. In October 1835, he wrote from Cork to advise his brother Horatio that many at Birr in Kings County and Castle Willington in Tipperary had decided of our way of thinking about things, and that in the latter location, Tipperary, up to 200 people were attending our meetings. On both sides of the Irish Sea and even into the continent, brethren gatherings were growing in number and size, and Darby was offering them pastoral care, creating a community of brethren more or less in his own image. After the death of Lady Powerscourt in 1836, he began to travel in French-speaking Europe, where his followers quickly became known as Darbists and inspired the title of a Belgian beer made of fig, which apparently his followers enjoyed. In Geneva, he reported to a friend, he spent the happiest moments of my life. And in Switzerland, he certainly made an impact. In 1842, 60 members of one of the larger dissenting congregations withdrew under Darby's influence. By 1844, a critical correspondent reported, Darbyism had infected the majority of the Swiss dissenting congregations. His ideas spread to almost every dissenting church in the country, so that multitudes belonging to the national church enrolled themselves among his disciples. Swiss dissidents who were troubled by his doctrines were supported by Scottish Congregationalists, while Swiss Baptists much more aggressively competed with what they dismissed as Darbyism. The Controversies were the context for the publication of an early critical assessment of his teaching by Johann Jakob Herzog, a professor of historical theology at Lausanne. By the mid-1840s, Darbyism was a force to be reckoned with in Britain, in Ireland, and on the continent too. Reflecting back on this period, Darby remembered how quickly his thinking came together. What was obscure for us one year became an axiom the following year. His status as a leader among brethren was assured as he grew in confidence about his new teaching. And that really is how the trouble began. By the mid-1840s, tensions within the movement had come to focus on the Plymouth Assembly that had given the movement its designation. In 1845, Darby returned from several years of missionary work in Switzerland and France to discover how far the Assembly had moved from its original principles of gathering and indeed from the Christology of the ecumenical creeds. In his absence, a party in the Assembly had developed criticisms of his theology and leadership style, while Benjamin Wills Newton, a younger man who'd come to dominate this assembly, was promoting teaching on the humanity of Christ that was widely regarded as heterodox. But Newton was supported by the majority of the Plymouth Brethren. In the winter of 1845, Darby withdrew from this meeting, established a new fellowship in the town, and called upon brethren everywhere else to choose between the meetings. During the wretched paper war that ensued, he became a figurehead for those who championed better coordination and tighter discipline among assemblies. But his own decision was clear. The assembly that had given the Brethren movements its name had become the first to be excluded from his fellowship. And so, in 1848 and 49, Brethren divided between those in favour of open fellowship, who argued that congregations should be autonomous, and exclusives, whose vision of connected congregations allowed for the more effective implementation of ecclesiastical discipline. Darby became one of the key leaders of the movement of exclusives. As Brethren divided, he retained the loyalty of the majority of those in England, but lost much of his influence in Scotland. For some exclusives, like William Henry Dorman, in the centre of the screen, a convert from the Congregational ministry, Darby was a hero, the man who went single-handed to oppose error in its stronghold in Plymouth, as Dorman put it. And yet, as the new network coalesced, even Dorman found that he could not submit to his mentor's increasing authority and to the theological innovations it introduced. Together with Percy Francis Hall, again on the screen, who had been Darby's prayer book reading preaching partner, Dorman campaigned against efforts to centralise decision-making within the exclusive network. For controversy continued. In the late 1850s, exclusive brethren were rocked by Darby's argument that Christ had experienced what he called a third class of sufferings, sufferings that did not contribute to the atonement. Some of Darby's friends and some of his long-standing critics believed inaccurately that this was replaying the position for which Newton had been condemned 10 years or so previously. The controversy could have been catastrophic for the maintenance of community discipline. But Dorman refused to form a party, discussing the matter only with Darby and a small group of friends, at least until 1866, when Darby sent him a curt note, as Dorman put it, and declined any further correspondence on the matter. Dorman responded by publishing his side of the correspondence, emphasising that his friend's authority among exclusive brethren was now uncontested. For Dorman, the division in 1866 represented the development of a dangerously effective structure of command and control. He worried that the centralising tendencies among exclusive brethren would be reinforced, as he put it, by the disciples of Mr. Darby, who are diligently training themselves to fill his place when he is gone. But far from causing embarrassment, Darby's elevation among exclusives was providing the brethren with their theology, their identity, and increasingly also their name. But as Darby's influence expanded, brethren continued to divide. After falling out with the Newton Party and the Open Brethren in 1848, and after falling out with the more independent spirits among the exclusives in 1866, Darby began to work hard to connect groups of those who remained, making 6 trips to North America from the mid-1860s and travelling as far as Australia and New Zealand, where at the age of 75, he appears to have learned and preached in Maori. In 1879, he became embroiled in a dispute with other prominent leaders about the boundaries of fellowship and the processes by which those boundaries should be maintained. By 1880, he had fallen out with almost everybody. He had rejected almost all of the original founders of the movement, and he had largely withdrawn from wider Brethren culture. I do not write in any magazine now, he explained in February 1881. I am not at all happy about the brothers' book-selling concerns. The spirit of the world has got thoroughly hold of it. Several months later, he grieved about the complete demoralization of the Plymouth Brethren movement. Even those who had separated from ecclesiastical corruption in the 1820s had become 60 years later infected by the ruin of the church. And yet, Darby was coming to this conclusion, even as his prophetic expectations were beginning to be confirmed. Events, he thought, were beginning to line up with his prophetic expectations. For he believed the growth of democracy and the extension of the franchise would lead inevitably to the breakup of the United Kingdom and to independence for Ireland. The European powers would take advantage of this opportunity to create a confederation of states aligned with the boundaries of the Western Roman Empire. This European superstate would enter into conflict with Russia about the control of Palestine. Jews would return to Palestine, set up a Jewish state, rebuild the temple, and reconstitute the temple liturgies. For Darby was convinced the end was at hand. His will bore witness to these changing circumstances. He made his testament on the 2nd of March 1881, offering very generous legacies for women in whose homes he had been made welcome, with 3 additional codicils over the following year, ensuring that his lamp, his dressing gown, and his watch all found worthy recipients. When he died at the end of April 1882, as one of the period's most published and most widely travelled men, his movement was weakening. As a contracted and highly politicised version of his ideas was about to be globalised, and perhaps, as news headlines suggest, create the very conditions it feared. Thanks very much.